Hello and welcome. I'm Tracey Polowich, host of the Excellence Connection podcast, where we connect our listeners with subject matter experts, knowledge, and resources to help improve organizational performance and guide people along their excellence journey. Today, my guest is Dan Batista, Executive Director at Citizen First, the Institute for Citizen-Centered Services in Canada. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you, Tracey. Pleasure to be with you today.
I'm so happy that you were able to join me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. We're going to talk about the customer today, and that's one of the key management areas of the organizational excellence framework and a practice common to high-performing organizations. I'd like you to just give a brief introduction of yourself and some of your background, please.
Sure. Thank you. I'm currently the Executive Director of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service, or simply known as Citizen First, which is a not-for-profit organization that was created by government for government. So we're quite unique in that really our purpose or reason for existing is to work with governments across Canada and in fact internationally to really promote and find ways to implement citizen-centric services. So a bit about me, and then I'll talk quickly about the Institute itself. Prior to joining the Institute in 2015, I worked for the federal government, and I was there for about 25 years or so. And I did a number of things over those years, but I started mostly kind of in a policy role and gradually moved towards program or service delivery. And specifically in the late 1990s, early 2000s, dating myself here, I was heavily involved in what was called Government Online. So it was the Government of Canada's first sort of major efforts to really modernize how it delivered services by way of leveraging, obviously, the internet and internet technologies. From that, my role really evolved to the development and eventually the delivery of a couple of key programs targeted at small businesses and entrepreneurs. One was known as Canada Business, and it was basically a network of service centers and an online service to really help, again, entrepreneurs find their way through the various levels of government programs and services to really start, manage and grow a business. In addition, I was involved in something called Bizpal, which was reflective of the government of the day's sort of goal to really simplify or reduce the aggravation, the friction, if you will, in terms of meeting or complying with the numerous permits, licenses, and regulations that all levels of government require of businesses. So that was something I did. And that sort of led me towards my current work at the Institute, because it was really through that work and my work with my colleagues across the country and trying to build really what I would term as a pan-Canadian approach to integrating services for businesses across, again, all levels of government. That really brought me to the Institute and some of the research they were doing, and then ultimately my interest in joining and taking on the role as Executive Director. So the Institute itself, and I'll be very brief, as I said, is a not-for-profit organization that was created by government for government. And what that means is basically we were created to be a legal entity to support the work of two major national councils that exist. One, and again, I apologize for the long labels, but it's the Public Sector Service Delivery Council, or the PSSDC, and the other one is the Public Sector Chief Information Officer Council. And what these bodies are, basically they comprise senior officials from across Canada, from various government organizations who come together in their respective fields to look at ways to improve services for Canadians, both as individuals and businesses, and really sort of blend, the policy program design components with obviously the enabling technologies to go with that. So the Institute was created in large part to enable these councils to do the work they need to do to set the pan-Canadian priorities, and to collaborate to invest in projects that would then be leveraged and used elsewhere. That's a big part of what we do at the Institute. In addition, as I mentioned, we conduct research. So we manage what's called the Citizens First and Business First studies. We undertake these studies every other year, basically, and they're really high-level looking at how Canadian citizens and businesses receive their services from government. So their actual experience, their expectations, the reputation that governments have. So we use these insights to then help inform governments across Canada. And in fact, our model has been replicated overseas and become really sort of the gold standard by which we carry out client or citizen satisfaction work. In addition to that, we also provide assistance with regard to measuring performance and benchmarking performance at a program or service level. So we do have tools and services for that as well. And finally, we deliver training that's, again, designed for public servants with the goal of trying to professionalize public sector service delivery. So we offer certification programs as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of who we are and what we do.
That's great. Thank you for that. And, it's something I think that is really needed in government. We get working as government employees and, working towards the direction that has been, set down for us. And often we forget about what we're doing this for and who we're doing it for. And so I really like that citizen-centered aspect to it. So your background in government service provision and your ties with the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service really provides a solid background on which to discuss how to achieve excellence with respect to the customer. And like you, I've spent a lot of my career in public service, and I'd like to discuss some of the parallels of public and private sector service provision. So can you explain the difference between a market-driven client versus what you called an involuntary client, kind of a taxpayer?
Right. That's a great question, because fundamentally, and in fact, just last week I was at a webinar and it was all about client experience, right? And kind of what motivates and what drives organizations to want to improve, to excel, right? To be excellent. And often there's always the comparison between public and private sectors, right? And I think, to me, fundamentally, the notion of what we often refer to now as simply CX is the same. It's about providing the best service possible. It's about thinking outside in. It's about being client or citizen centric. I think what drives that work, of course, is different, right? So if we look at the private sector, right, or customers, the reality is that in a competitive marketplace, presumably there are several vendors of a similar service or product, which means that as a consumer, if I don't like the service, I can literally click away, walk away, or call away, right? And what I mean by that is I can vote with my feet and my wallet. I can just say, you know what, I'm not buying your product or service, I'm going elsewhere, right? Government is different in that, yes, for the most part, as taxpayers, we may not ask for the services or necessarily want some of the services, but we don't really have that option, right? There is only one supplier of driver's licenses per province, right? There's only, one issuer of health cards, et cetera, et cetera. So the distinction that I make often when responding to this type of questions, in the public sector, the drive to improve should be based on the fact that your clients can't walk away from you, right? That, to me, is the driver. If you're in the private sector, you're not doing well because your numbers will go down, right? Your revenue will drop. It's different in government, right? It is not necessarily about the bottom line, but the bottom line that the public sector and the public sector translates into what we refer to as the service value chain equation, which really comes down to the degree to which citizens have trust and confidence in their public institutions, right? And if you look at what is happening in the world today, and we certainly are not going to get into politics, but there is a high degree of divisiveness, right? And a general decline that's been happening for years in the overall level of trust, right? In governing institutions, public sector institutions. A lot of what government provides often becomes kind of one of the measuring or metrics, if you will, of the degree to which there's trust and confidence. In other words, if I am a taxpayer and the service I receive is poor and it's continuously poor, and I don't feel I'm getting value for the money, it will eventually erode my confidence in that institution, right, or in government. And we are seeing that, right, to a certain extent. So it is a different distinction. It isn't so much a bottom line. I'm not, you're not in the business of appeasing your shareholders so much, but you are in the business of ensuring that integrity of basically our democratic system, if you will, right? By ensuring that there is high levels of degree of trust, confidence, such that there is value derived from the taxes that are being paid. So it's a bit more complicated fundamentally, like if you look at kind of what drives the difference. But at the end of the day, I mean, the principles of good, client or citizen experience management is fundamentally putting the consumer, the client, or the citizen at the center of how services are designed and delivered, right? So it's not all that different, but I think the means, the means aren't different. The ends can be, right? One obviously is bottom line, revenue, profits, and the other one is really about trust and confidence in our way of governing, if you will.
Yeah, I think that really is important, that trust issue, and it really can make a difference in the relationship that levels of government can have with their constituents. Mm-hmm. So at ICCS, you help the public sector pursue service excellence through that research and learning, collaboration, and professional development. Can you describe some of the best practices that you recommend for delivering service excellence from that government perspective?
Yeah, so if I had, the ability to sort of summarize that, I probably would be able to capitalize on that. But I think it really varies, right? So from where I sit and kind of, the work I've done in the past and what I see, there are some key components, right? In organizations that are successful, or jurisdictions, I tend to start at the jurisdictional level. But it typically starts with senior level leadership and commitment, right? To the notion of being citizen-centric, right? And that's not to say that it always has to be top-driven, but it tends to be one of the key components in organizations or jurisdictions that drives kind of the grounding, if you will, of a philosophy of service excellence. Because it is not, I put it this way, for the faint-hearted. It is grueling work. It is work that is never done, right? So leadership has to not only say the right words, articulate a vision, but that vision has to be relatable, right? It has to be understood by everyone who works for the organization, and everyone needs to know what their role is vis-a-vis that vision, right? Because again, and I certainly, don't want to sit here and say, this will make you successful, that won't. But it's then how you put these pieces together. So certainly empowering your employees, empowering those who are on the front lines, those that interact, enabling them to make decisions, right, within, again, the sort of limitations of legislation, et cetera, right? But to allow them to use their judgment to go the extra mile, right? To be, able to anticipate and respond to the challenges that a client might have. These are all important things. Capturing all of this, right, in some service strategy that isn't just about having a document, but it's a living kind of, instrument, if you will, that continuously is revised, refined, right, in light of, what is happening. Training, right, ensuring that, again, the employees understand their role, that they're given the right tools and the resources to actually provide the best service possible. And I think, in addition to all of that, I think, what I've seen in successful organizations or governments, is that they start to eventually, the term I use, and I apologize for this, is they kind of bake it into the DNA, into the fabric, if you will, of the organization, right? It's not just on a whim. It's not just we ought to be doing this. It's, again, something that has to be instilled and nurtured and kind of reinforced continuously. So there's many aspects to it. And the other thing I would add is, back to our research, is listening to the voice of the citizen or the client. And that means, not simply saying, oh, we ought to survey, right? Or we ought to find ways. Like, it has to be built in. It has to be done on a regular basis. You have to, or you need to be benchmarking. You need to be comparing, right? So it is work, as I said, that's just never done, right? Because it's a continual process that, iterative, and today you're seeing it become more agile, right? It's not just undertaking a client satisfaction survey maybe once a year, right? It's about being able to harvest, right, the ever increasing amounts of unstructured data that's out there, right, through social media, through chats, through whatever, and being able to build capacity within the organization to then process that, to analyze that, to draw insight from that, and then to immediately act upon that to improve, the services that are rendered. And of course, it's all of the things, and I won't spend time on this, but being an organization that develops excellent, service design practices, right? So again, usability testing, iterative changes, improvements, right? All of that, putting all of that together, which again, takes an enormous amount of commitment across the organization, but again, is reinforced at the highest levels as that's the business that we're in. In fact, last week I attended a webinar, and one of the things that struck me, and this was an assistant deputy minister who said, our product is service, right? And I hadn't heard it that way, but I mean, it wasn't so much that they're delivering services on behalf of the various ministries or agencies within the provincial, jurisdiction, but it was that their actual product, the only thing that they were in the business of, was service, right? And making sense of all that. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts, in response to your question.
Thank you. And yeah, those are really great ideas about how to, align the employee on the importance of the customer from, the top down in the organization. And you mentioned, baking into the fabric of the organization, so to speak. That's, basically the culture and the way we do things, right? And getting everybody on the same page about that. So I really like that. And maybe just to take things a bit further down that path, can you describe the customer journey mapping tool and how that practice can be beneficial to an organization?
One of the things before I speak to that I would just add, with regard to employee engagement, is that through our research and over the years, one thing we've definitely noted is that organizations that have higher levels of employee satisfaction tend to score much higher in terms of client or citizen satisfaction with the organization. So again, that connection is essential, and which leads into your question about journey mapping, right? And I must admit, sometimes I'm perplexed by the amount of sort of thought or conversation about journey maps and why they matter and why they're important. The way I sort of tell myself that is really all about is that it's really about understanding the relationship that your client, that the citizen has with your organization. Because so often, and I'm the first to admit that even, that I'm guilty of this at times as well, as we tend to think transactional, right? So when we carry out citizen satisfaction, or as we refer to as CSAT work, we tend to be measuring an interaction at a given point, right? But journey mapping really is about understanding all the different ways that your client is interacting with your organization, right, in the process of obtaining a service or a product or whatever the case may be. So to me, it's about fundamentally putting yourself in the shoes of that individual, right? What is it like for them to try to find the information on your website? what is it like for them when they trip up or don't understand what you're saying because that content is written in such a way that it's not clear, right? That perhaps it's written more in a government speak than it is a typical, Canadian layperson speak, right? What is it like when they try to reach out to a contact center, right, to get in touch with someone, and then have to go through some kind of decision tree to determine, where their call should be. So journey mapping to me is, it's about all of that, but it's really about understanding that experience from a relational point of view, right? Because if you don't have a handle on it, the way I look at it is like this, Tracy. Ask yourself how easy it is for you as an employee of your organization to get your work done in that organization. The chances are, if you struggle, right, to get work done because of, again, what your journey map might be like within that organization, there's a strong likelihood that that's going to be reflected on the outside trying to look in, right? So to me, journey mapping is, how do we make things ultimately better for our clients, knowing, what they're experiencing, what their frustrations are, their challenges, right? And again, when you look at this from the perspective of the public sector, it's not so much about brand loyalty like it is in the private sector, right? Because a lot of the journey mapping work done, in the private sector is really tied to brand and loyalty, right? In the public sector, it's really about reducing the friction and the irritation and the aggravation, right? And we've all experienced it, right? And ultimately, it comes back to, for governments, certainly, if it's not about so much brand, it's about obviously the best possible service for the best possible price, right? So it's about how you reduce the number of interactions or the number of times it takes someone to actually get the information, the service they need. So it is a critical aspect of a client or citizen experience work, for sure. There's no question about that.
Yeah, a couple of things that you mentioned, and I want to just expand on. We as municipal employees in some cases, or government employees in some cases, we do this work every day, and we experience the applications and the services that we deliver on a daily basis. But the citizen, they might only interact once a year or at a very seldom time in their lives. And so what might seem easy to us is not necessarily going to be second nature to the citizens. And so I think that this customer journey mapping can really be helpful to get the employees of a government thinking from the perspective of the customer. And so does it have to be a big deal, or are there some simple ways that government employees can kind of use that customer journey mapping idea and methodology? Do you have any simple steps that can be followed?
So I'm going to have to, again, preface my response by saying that, having been a practitioner, right, in the federal government for a number of years, there's always a danger that these things turn into more complicated effort, projects than they need to be, right? I think often we fail to look at this in the simplest ways and say, who can we talk to, right? And who can we just find out? Now, I know I'm oversimplifying because, again, certainly I can't speak to other levels of government. In the federal context, public opinion research is managed within very tight guidelines, right? And at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. You're asking for the public's opinion on what it's like to interact with organizations. And you're right, it can be challenging because in some instances, for example, to pick on CRA, if you're typical, Canadian, you interact with them maybe once, twice a year, and that's it. And hopefully it goes well and you don't hear from them, or you hope not to. In other cases, you may be interacting much more often. For example, if you're unfortunately in the situation to collect employment insurance and whatnot. So these things sometimes can, I think, turn into overly complex, exercises when the end of the day, it's really about capturing feedback, right? It's finding out what it's like in the day of, right? And how you do that. So it is important to build in. But what I'm noticing, and I don't think, journey mapping is disappearing anytime soon, but a lot of the work that I'm involved in these days really is with regard to the use of artificial intelligence, right? And the ability now to leverage AI to conduct analysis on large amounts of unstructured data, right? Because typically we know that if your service is good and your client or citizen is happy, more likely than not, they're probably not going to go and post something, right? Or get on social media or say anything because they got what they were looking for. And maybe it wasn't the greatest service, but it wasn't a terrible experience. However, the opposite tends to hold true. If it's a terrible experience, they're going to go and tell somebody about it, right? They're going to post, or it'll get out there somewhere. So being able to pull that information is becoming more and more important, and leveraging AI, approaches and methodologies is something that we're starting to look at, because it is becoming increasingly abundant and available to government organizations. And there isn't a lot of, well, I would say this way, I guess, structure to how we analyze unstructured client feedback, right? So I think we're still very much in the early days, but I think, again, this is where we can learn from the private sector, because they're certainly further ahead, right? And again, tend to invest more heavily in how they, manage social media, right? And what's being said about their brand, and again, the impact on loyalty. I'm starting to see this come more into the public sector now as well.
That's so fantastic to hear. Did you ever think that you would use artificial intelligence and government practices in the same sentence? So I think that's good to hear that progress is happening. So you've led quite a few innovative projects and in support of customer service. And you mentioned a couple of those, such as Bizpal earlier. And as you mentioned, that's that online service for federal, provincial, and municipal license and permit information, making it easy for businesses as a one-stop sort of shop to gather the information that they need for the permits and licenses that they need. And back in 2005, that Bizpal was a leading edge idea. So for you, what factors and thought processes led to this innovative idea?
That's a great question. So the origins of what today is known as Bizpal actually date back to probably around 2001, 2002. And I mentioned sort of in my opening remarks my role in what was then known as Government Online, and the objective of that major investment was to make or to have Canada be the most connected country, government to its citizens, right? Through those early sort of iterations of us trying to pull together the right type of information and services, and again, it was in those days, I certainly don't want to take away from the accomplishment, but it was pretty basic stuff. It was kind of like compiling lists of links that Canadians, would hopefully find what they were looking for, right? The idea of Bizpal surfaced when the government of the day really started to put emphasis on the regulatory burden concerns pertaining to businesses, and especially small, medium-sized businesses. And really what they wanted to see was ways that we could, again, lessen the burden of interacting with government. So this notion of streaming or streamlining and integrating information relating to compliance started to surface and bubble. And it started basically through what I refer to as, and my colleagues do, is the coalition of the willing, right? So were there, who in Canada at the provincial and the territorial levels, and eventually municipalities, might be interested in getting together to talk about ways we could try to make it easier for businesses to get to the specific licenses and permits they needed to get on with their business. So Bizpal was one of the early initiatives that came out of Government Online as a sort of a special project or funding was set aside to look at this. So over a number of years, it started to evolve into obviously what it is today. And the goal was really to not so much create a one-stop shop, because and I recall my work at the time was looking at this notion of syndication, right? And what is syndication? Well, the idea was to not create a destination necessarily, but to put well-designed, well-packaged information, right, and services in the places where entrepreneurs or small businesses might be likely to go looking for information. So it wasn't a let's build a bizpal.ca site necessarily, although there is one, but it was really how we bring together the provinces, territories, and municipalities together to manage information, right? And it was kind of a landmark, project in that up until that point, and again, it was very early days of going online and the web, but we were starting to look at really the organization of information, right? And how that would then be rendered back to clients, right? So it started to move away from just kind of the wrapper, right? How we made websites basically, right? And it was certainly not just about a website, but it was how do we bring federal, provincial, or territorial and municipal information integrated in a way that would be presented based on the unique scenario of the client. So one of the things that was really innovative with regard to Bizpal was we asked, I'll call them users, but entrepreneurs, small businesses, what they were trying to accomplish. Okay, where are you setting up a business? What type of business is it? Will you be doing any of the following things, right? So through that sort of question process, right, it then generated a list of potential permits and licenses that they would need to look at, right? So it was kind of the first attempt to, I would say to some extent, to customize or personalize information specifically to the needs of the client. So it was definitely, I think groundbreaking in that work, and it also subsequently obviously has led to numerous efforts within Canada to really offer more customized, personalized service, through digital enablement. So it was, an incredible project or service to be a part of. I know at the time it was certainly loved by the government of the day because it was a shining example, of the attempt to reduce red tape, the regulatory burden, and what it did actually. One last point I'll make is that it really brought to light the fact that governments are great at creating new rules, right, and regulations, not so good at getting rid of them when they're not needed. Right. So it really kind of exposed, stuff that people hadn't even thought of or seen or knew to some extent because it just sat on the books. Right. And when it was brought into a digital format and it could be displayed depending on, kind of what the needs were of a client, it got people scratching their heads and saying, why do we still have stuff like this on the books? Right. So it actually led to work related to, again, regulatory work to reduce the number of regulations, right? And so really, really a fascinating project that I think, like I said, broke a lot of new ground, and certainly to this day, and I still have colleagues who work and manage Bizpal, who are looking at kind of definitely, next generation Bizpal type services from that.
Oh, there's so much in that. So you mentioned a couple of things like organizing information and again, just kind of walking through the thought process of a business to learn, what their needs are, and then making that as simple and easy as possible for them. And all of those ideas that you mentioned around that innovation and the process, it doesn't sound that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So are there other steps or methods that service providers can use to generate more innovative service to their customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I think it really comes down to the degree to which an organization is willing to learn, right? And to always excel, right? And that means that, you know, and one of the things that I tried to do and hopefully accomplished in my years in the federal government was to create teams and empower them, right? And that's not to say, you know, you set them up and you walk away and you let them kind of do whatever, but you give them enough cover so that they can innovate without, you know, not necessarily the pressures, but from distractions, if you will, right? And I think organizations that you know lean towards excellent tend to again empower and enable employees, especially those who either interact directly with clients or design services. They allow them to do their work, right? They allow them to kind of explore and experiment, right? The degree and the tolerance for lack of success in the public sector is well noted, right? So there is always the fear that, well, what if it's failure? My approach, and even to this day, is that you always start small, right? Start small, test it out. You know, today what we refer to as iterative and agile, I think, you know, has long existed. We didn't coin or phrase those approaches necessarily that way, maybe 20 years ago or 25 years ago, but that's really the essence of service, right? If you tell yourself you've got it right, then you definitely are never going to get it right, because you ought to be always looking at ways to improve. And that means that service is never right. Like, you need to continuously think about ways to improve, right? And I think that comes down to having people that have that mindset that, okay, you know, we've just improved this, but you know, what do our clients think? Oh, we didn't anticipate that. Okay, so how do we? So it's that, you know, continuous process of improvement, of innovation. You know, some organizations do that really well, right? And again, I think it's often, I want to say, you know, it's an old kind of expression. You kind of got to be good to be lucky and lucky to be good. It's bringing the right leadership, the right people, the right environment to make a lot of this stuff happen. Certainly from, again, what I see across the country and from the, you know, again, the work that I do, the common ingredient is always, you know, strong leadership, good vision, commitment to employees, empowerment, and constantly seeking feedback from the client, right? You put those together in the right measure, it tends to lend itself to good working environments and ultimately better service experiences.
Yeah, and you mentioned about, I guess, that phenomenon of doing what we've always been doing and not being able to let go of things that you don't need to be doing anymore. And I think this is really key for government. You mentioned about, you know, good at putting rules in place, not so good at removing them if they're not required anymore. I think the same goes for practices and even spending. Like, most of my time has been with municipal government, and you know, I've seen so many municipalities, they add and add and add on to their service provision, but they don't really ever evaluate who's using those services, how valuable are they, how are they connecting to the strategic vision of that community and so on. And so, you know, that cost just keeps going up and up and up. And even if we go down to the granular level of practices, and if people aren't evaluating those practices to see if there's steps that could be skipped, or, you know, stop printing something and filing it, that little bit of time that takes adds up over a year, right? And that can equal cost reduction for the government. So yeah, very interesting conversation there. So I want to just shift to a little bit to digitization. And so with the pandemic, I think we're starting to see a bit of a trend towards further digitization of services. And what I wanted to ask you is, are there any key factors that organizations should keep in mind as they transform from the paper or manual-based platform to a digital platform?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess I would start my answer by saying, in the research that we've conducted over the last number of years, and certainly in the last, I would say 6 to 8 years through by way of Citizens First, right? We've really focused on, Canadians and their willingness to do more online, right? And to interact with their governments more online. And every time we conduct a Citizens First study, everything, that comes back to us is like, that makes absolute sense, right? And what Canadians tell us over and over is we are good with doing more online. We are good with more services online. And certainly, as you said, the pandemic, I mean, it was just remarkable, the acceleration. And again, my past and my involvement and I'll just call it the grind of convincing senior executives of the need to move and become, online, today digital, was always a challenge. But the pandemic accelerated that and has forever changed that. And what we saw in Citizen First 2020, again, was Canadians basically saying, yeah, we're good with this. We've told you this, but there's one key issue here. And this is, I guess, my answer to your question, and that is, going digital doesn't mean that it stops being human, right? And I think sometimes we forget that delivering services digitally just means that we continue to practice excellent service design, right? And build that in. And a big part of that is knowing that inevitably humans trip up, right? They will trip up. Your clients when they're trying to get to that, bit of information or that service. What they want to know is that they can reach out to someone for help, right? That they can talk to someone. Someone will actually help them. It is still, to me personally, remarkable in this day and age, the low scores that we see when it comes to Canadians interacting with any form of the phone channel, so contact centers in this case, which to me, again, well beyond today's talk, but simply a question of dollars and resources to staff call centers or contact centers adequately. But the message here is that, digital enablement is just that, it's technology, but it is at the end of the day about good service, right? And good service means that you write well, right? At a level that's understood. You design services in a way that, people can work their way through, without confusion. You set standards, right, around, okay, when can I expect something, right? When can I expect to hear from someone? When should I expect someone to tell me whether or not I qualify? And I know that there's someone there if I need help, right? And I can actually reach someone and talk to someone who can help guide me, right? So to me, those fundamental components, and there's many more, but just, as kind of a brief overview, continue, right? They continue going forward. And it doesn't get any easier, right? Because just because we've gone pretty much fully digital doesn't mean that people don't, they still want to be able to walk in. Like there is still a portion of Canadians who want to access service centers. They want to call somebody. That's not going away. Obviously, the degree to which people prefer to do it online has increased significantly. There are still concerns, obviously, around privacy, right, and protection of personal information and all those things. But those don't preclude Canadians from wanting to access more government services online if they're well designed, if they know that there's support there. So again, with the rush to digitize and provide services, Canadians are just reminding government saying, this is great, we can live with this, we actually like it, but we want to see that help is there when we need it. And like I said, I think for public sector leaders, those that were skeptical or unsure about the degree to which they ought to invest in online services or digital government, there's no going back now, right? There is no turning back. This wasn't simply a fix to address the challenges of the pandemic. Citizens have said, we want it all. We want excellent service online. We want much, much better service when it comes to talking to someone. And if need be, yes, I still want to be able to actually walk into a center. So, yeah, I wish my colleagues luck trying to figure all that out going forward. But that's how, that's what we're hearing from Canadians for sure.
Yeah, and I don't know. I look at it as a positive from the pandemic, if there can be any positive, is it's accelerated things like this that, like we have kind of touched on a little bit. You touched on it. Government is very anti-risk and slow to get things implemented. And in this case, they've kind of had to be a little bit more aggressive, and that's good. And it proves, that government can do things quicker, and maybe gives them some confidence that it doesn't always have to be 100% right off the bat. It can be, they can make mistakes, and they can, work through problems as they're getting things implemented. And I think that's all really good for government to learn. And, we're all just human, right? And it's part of the process. And so I really appreciate that advice and the information that you shared there. So my last question that I'm asking all of my guests is, how do you remain in the growth zone? So in other words, what do you do to deepen your growth mindset?
That's an excellent question. I've always considered myself a student and a learner. Even given the fact I spent a number of years in the federal government working on some, very exciting projects. The last 7 years as the executive director of the Institute. What I tell myself is, or what I do to remind myself is like, I still haven't really figured any of this out, right? And so I'm always looking for opportunities to hear thought leaders, right? So certainly staying connected to, what's going on in sort of the broader sort of CX world, both in the private and public domains. Connected, a big part of my role as executive director obviously is working with partner or similar like organizations, both here at home and abroad. So again, the opportunity to interact with organizations that provide me with different perspectives on the challenges they're facing, I find extremely valuable. I love learning, being just inquisitive, right? So even simple things like signing up for quick boot camps and kind of working through lessons, articles, videos, that sort of thing. One of the things that I'm very fortunate as executive director at the ICCS, Citizen First, we run webinars throughout the year. So we tend to bring in quite a few guest speakers. Again, I'm fortunate I've met, incredible folks, really bright folks to bring a lot of, incredible ideas to sort of our community. So I get to interact with that. Half the time I'm so distracted by what's being said in some of these webinars that I fail to realize I'm actually moderating and producing them. So again, it's just trying to stay on top, right? And the recognition that it's an ever evolving field. I mean, I mentioned the use, for example, of artificial intelligence. So we're working with a couple of Canadian-based companies, startups that are basically using AI for data analytics, right? Specifically with regard to client satisfaction. So again, the opportunity to learn, just this week, I participated in a panel. Actually, it's a series of meetings that we're having with some colleagues internationally from that we work closely with at the Civil Service College in Singapore, the Model Center in Dubai. And again, that opportunity to learn from what others are doing. I'm always amazed, right? Because again, the ICCS Citizen First is typically better known internationally, right? Because a lot of folks will kind of find us and are amazed by what we do and you know, and how we're structured. But to me, I'm always more interested in hearing, you know, what they're doing. And so again, you look to some of the organizations, you know, certainly our colleagues in Singapore, and how progressive they are in learning, right? And the pursuit of excellence within their public sector. It just it's fascinating. So those are just some of the ways. And again, like I said, I'm very fortunate by way of the role I have here at the ICCS to constantly be exposed to, you know, bright people, innovative ideas and thoughts. So that's typically how I like to stay aware of what's going on in this ever-changing world.
Yeah, there's so many great opportunities now. And, you know, we've been really fortunate to have the technology to be able to connect with people all over the world. And so I want to thank you so much, Dan. This has been really insightful. And as you mentioned at the beginning, you know, for-profit service provision and public service provision, really there's different drivers, but the methodologies are fairly similar and can be applicable in both realms. So I think there's a lot that anyone can take from the information that you've shared today, whether they are working in government. Even though we focus a lot on government, I think there's a lot of aspects that can be applicable to business as well. So I'm very grateful for you joining me today. Thank you so much. Where can people find more information about Citizen First and the Institute for Citizen-Centered Services? So
yeah, just Google us. Citizenfirst.ca is our website. We also are on Twitter at Citizen First. So again, easy to find us. Follow us if you can, and visit the website. And as a teaser, we will have a refreshed web presence in the near future. And again, we're trying to practice what we preach and make that site more client-centric and less organizational-centric. So thank you. It was a pleasure to be here today with you, Tracey.
Thanks so much. Bye now.
Bye-bye.